Right. We are on recording mode, and our presentation today is about the importance of communication, and I will be presenting my screen to you. We've already talked about what communication is and how and why communication is important. Can you see my screen, all of you? Just let me know. Topu?
Yes, sir.
It is visible, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we have talked about communication, right? All of you can please switch off your microphones, please, as we speak. We have talked about communication as the process of sending and receiving information, and we had talked about the various elements of communication, including sender, message, channel, and receiver. Somebody's microphone is on. Please switch off the microphone, please. Please switch off the microphone. Whose microphone is on? Please switch it off. Right. Okay. So we talked about the communication patterns, and types of communication, including verbal communication, non-verbal communication, written communication, and visual communication. And we talked about the various models of communication. We talked about the Shannon-Weaver model, where you have a process of the sender, the sendee, and the message, where the sender encodes the message in language and the receiver decodes the message through his language, as it were. Now, this obviously leads to another model called the Lasswell model, where you have the different medias that are used in the model of communication, in the way that it can be not only through audio, video, it can be through a lot of social media. The medium of communication becomes important. And we had talked about this model where the content becomes important, and to whom is it directed, and what is the impact of communication is what Lasswell talks about. Now, Lasswell, of course, enlarges the communication into a mass communication model. Now, in the Berlow model, what we have is also the importance of social systems and cultures. So, for example, when you do a pranam to your elders, or when you fold your hands and say namaste, that is a particular kind of a cultural code that you are sending. So, communication does not only depend on language or gestures, but it also depends on the culture from which you are speaking, right? Or in which you are interacting and communicating. And we also had the Barnlund model, where you see, very importantly, Barnlund sees communication not as a one-way traffic or an exchange, but also in terms of the feedback. So he sees it as a cyclical model, where the message is delivered from the sender to the receiver, and the receiver then gives feedback. Those of you who use the Amazon app, for example, or those of you who use the Uber or the Ola app, will remember that they ask for your feedback. So that sort of completes the process of communication. So you are sure as to whether the person you are sending the communication to has actually received and understood the model. Right. Now we will come to the second part of our lecture. And that is, so in the first part, we covered this question about what is communication, what are the elements of communication, and what are the different models of communication. Today, what I am going to concentrate on is what are the different types of communication. And we'll divide this into verbal and non-verbal communication. So one uses words, the other does not use words. And we'll see what are the strategies of good communication, right? So verbal communication, of course, is defined as a process where you use words and speak. Verbal communication is spoken communication. So what can this be? What kinds of verbal communication do we have? We have intrapersonal communication, verbal communication. Intrapersonal is when it is within oneself. Very often you see, you tell yourself, keep it up, we have to do it, we have to do it, right? I will do it, I will do it. So you talk to yourself, you mutter to oneself. So intrapersonal communication is private and restricted to the person. These are silent conversations, right? So you might talk to oneself, you might also think to yourself, but you speak to yourself, right? And they primarily deal with internal thoughts in the mind. That is intrapersonal communication. Very often, you place yourself in two positions. You say, should I do it? This is the advantage. Shouldn't I do it? These are the advantages, right? So this is what intrapersonal, within the self communication, verbal communication is about. So when you see somebody muttering on the road to himself, that is intrapersonal. But intrapersonal is very rare or limited. What we do have is interpersonal communication. This is a one-to-one between two individuals, right? So interpersonal. So when I am talking to my friend, say when I'm talking to Topuda and telling him, Topu, please do this for me, this is an interpersonal. And Topu is replying, okay, Amrit, I will do this. Therefore, initially, I am the sender, he is the receiver. And then he is the sender, I am the receiver. So sender and receiver constantly swap roles, right? So this is interpersonal communication. This is the most frequent kind of conversation that we generally do. Then comes the communication which is in a small group, right? Say, for example, we are taking a small class. We are having a small meeting, right? Where each can interact and converse with all others. So you are free to ask me questions. You can talk to the other person. This can be in the form of a press conference. This can be in the form of a board meeting. This can be in the form of a team meeting. Say the Department of English decides to organize a play and everybody chips in with their suggestions in a meeting as to what roles who will take, what is the importance of the role, which play they will perform. Very often you have student meetings also, student body meetings also. So these are small groups. Now, the problem is very often they can be chaotic. So everybody starts talking at the same time. You just think about television debates, which often everybody starts to speak and nobody can be heard and difficult to interpret. Plus, there is the process of a miscommunication. Remember that if communication is very important, then miscommunication is also very important. So failure of communication, half communication, wrong communication is very, very common, and it can also be very fatal or very difficult, right? So when everybody speaks in a small group, there can be miscommunication. And of course, there's the final form of verbal communication, which is a public communication. So when an individual addresses a large gathering, say I am a politician X, I am attending a meeting with thousands of people are attending, this is a public communication, right? So when the Prime Minister comes on television and addresses the nation about the lockdown, that is a public communication. Very often, an example of this could be an election meeting, for example, where people talk to a lot of voters at the same time. So what are the forms of verbal communication? Intrapersonal, which is to oneself, interpersonal between two people, small group, which is between a restricted number of people, and public, which is among a wide range of people. But verbal communication is restricted to the word and the word alone. So language is the mode of verbal communication, right? When does verbal communication fail? When obviously somebody cannot speak or understand the language, or somebody cannot listen, right? So these are where there is a failure of verbal communication. Say, if you speak in Spanish and I do not know it, then verbal communication will fail. So what are the alternatives? We can communicate through sign language. That is the most primitive mode of communication, right? Okay, now let us come to non-verbal communication, a communication which takes place without words, without language. So what kinds of non-verbal communication are there? This is very important, and you need to note down or take a look later on at what are the different ways in which non-verbal communication happens. Now, this is a reasonably comprehensive.
অমৃতা একটু ফন্টটা বড় করা যাবে?
না, এটার থেকে ফন্ট আর বড় করা যাবে না. This is the maximum, right? Okay, they can take a look at it later on, maybe, right? And I am reading out so that they can sort of listen to this. I'm sorry, এর থেকে বেশি ফন্টটা বড় করা যাচ্ছে না. Right? Okay, so non-verbal communication takes place through first facial expression. So when I start the lecture, most of you smirk and say, oh, boring once again, and you make a face. That is a facial expression. What does it signify? It can signify happiness. If you smile when I talk to you, sadness, you are crying, facial expression. Anger, it can signify surprise. So I tell you, didn't you know that? You say, oh, and you just make a sign that you didn't know it. Then surprise, fear, disgust, right? Therefore, facial expressions are very strong, non-verbal modes of communication. They send out very strong signals. Very often, we understand the feedback through facial expressions. Even if you do not speak, your facial expression tells me what you intend to communicate. So reading facial expressions is very important. Then comes body movement and posture. So very often you see a person who is lazy, who will slouch. A person who wants to protest will immediately sit upright. So posture, the way in which you move your body and sit, is an important index of non-verbal communication, right? Then comes gestures. Gestures, say, look at me. I am telling you that you have to do this, and you say, did you see that? Topu, is this visible, what I'm saying, what I'm doing with my hand? Is it visible? Anybody?
No,
right. If I just wave my hand, right, or I wave my hand and say goodbye, I sort of make a gesture of a hug, right? So these gestures can also communicate. So gestures are very important in non-verbal communication. Right. So, but these gestures might be different. For example, if I hold up my hand to bless you, this is in India. So I am suggesting that I accept your proposal, or I am blessing your proposal. But in the West, that is not a blessing. That becomes, forbidding. No, I don't want this. Right. So these gestures can often be culture specific, right? Then comes the method of eye contact, communication through eye contact. Say, I'm trying to communicate to you, or your father is trying to say, please listen to me, you need to be disciplined, you need to do this, you need to do that, and you just don't look at him, you look away. Very often you do this. Now remember, when you are making eye contact, you are paying attention. When you are taking away eye contact, you are saying you are disinterested, or you are afraid, or you are lying. Very often you see interrogators, policemen, very often look for these body languages. These are called body languages, right? That a person, when he's lying, will often look away, will often look elsewhere, shift in his seat, right? So these give away the fact that you are lying. So eye contact. Very often, communication is made through touch. You meet your friend, you hug him very, very warmly, shows that you love him, right? You shake his hand very firmly, right? That shows you want to mix with him. But if he sort of wants to hug you and you push him away, that is a non-verbal communication, says you don't want him, right? You want to, sort of bring your girlfriend close and she just shoves you out. That means she does not love you that much, right? Space, once again, very important. This you need to understand, right? That very often if you go close to a person, very close to a person, then she or he moves away. That means by creating that space between you and him, right, or her, he or she wants to say that, we are not that close. Don't come that close to me, right? So once again, you see, you need to understand this, that, in some cultures, for example, say when I was in Europe, people used to kiss me on my cheeks, saying that is a gesture of affection. Now, if I try kissing somebody on the cheek here, I will get a tight slap. So you remember that non-verbal communication might also be culture specific, right? But very often, space, the concept of space and touch, non-verbal communication through space and touch conveys intimacy, affection, aggression, or dominance. Say somebody just encroaches on your space, catches you by your collar, right? And comes into your face and says, tell me what you want to tell me, right? So that is aggression. That is a communication of aggression. And very often, even voice can become a non-verbal mode of communication. So this, say, I shout at you, do it. No. These are words or sounds that we make, right? So these sounds can also be modes of non-verbal communication. When you are not speaking, but your sound is giving us the idea as to what you are feeling or what you want to tell me, right? So these are the different elements of non-verbal communication: facial expression, body movement and posture, gestures, eye contact, touch, space, and voice. I repeat, non-verbal communication is where language is not used. Very often these depend upon body movements, postures, facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, touch, sense of space, and voice. So what are the roles played by non-verbal communication? What does non-verbal communication do? How does it communicate? Repetition. Very often, repetition, I'm telling you, do you understand my point? You nod frequently. So that strengthens the verbal message being communicated. So you say, yes, sir, I understand, and you nod your head. I say, yes, he's understanding. Or you just say, no, I don't, and you nod your head from side to side. So you repeat that, no, you cannot understand me, right? Contradiction. Very often, it contradicts the verbal message, indicating to the audience that the speaker does not believe what he is saying. So you make a point that, Brutus is an honorable man, and then you wink at the audience. You wink at the audience. Chokmaro. And the audience immediately understands that you do not mean what you are saying, right? So contradict. So either repeat what you are saying or contradict what you are saying. Very often it substitutes. Facial expressions tell us, you don't need to talk. You can only tell us by your facial expressions, your non-verbal communication, what you want to say. They say you want, please, please, if you want some more milk, he just throws up his hand and says, no, I don't. It doesn't say, he just throws up the hands, and you understand, no, he does not want any milk. Very often, it is a gesture of complimenting. Complimenting is complimenting. Say, somebody has done very good work. There are a lot of English students here of the Department of English who have done very well in their internal that I took with them. So what do? Next time I meet them, I pat them on their back, right? I put a hand around their shoulder, right? So that compliments them. That tells them that, you've done well. So complimenting is done through nonverbal communication. And accenting or accentuating is, once again, emphasizing what I want to say. Say, suppose I say, I want to do this. You have to attend the class, and I pound the table, right? So I emphasize, I accentuate, I accent what I want to say, right? So this is a way in which very often nonverbal communication can substitute communication, and sometimes nonverbal communication can add to verbal communication. That is to say, verbal communication and nonverbal communication go hand in hand. This is what most of us do, don't we? We say, oh, hi, how are you? And I say, oh, I haven't met you for so long a time, and I hug somebody, right? So what am I doing? I'm speaking verbal communication as well as complementing it through non-verbal communication as well. So these are the roles played by non-verbal communication. Now we come to the third form of communication, that is written communication. And this is something which we'll talk about in detail in our next class, business communication, right? So what happens in business communication? Very often you write letters, although nobody right now writes letters anymore, but you used to write letters. They were intimate, they were personal, you told them things about yourself. But business transactions are different, right? You write with a purpose. You don't write just like that, right? So you don't write to your headmaster saying, oh, how good I am, how it is cloudy today. Your headmaster will box your ears. So in business, what do? What are the forms of business communication? It can be transactional, right? It can be transactional in the sense that the message is sent to get results. So I send a message to you that, you have to do this within this many hours. That's a transactional. Please send me across this mail, right? It's a quick clarification. It can be a meeting request. So I send you a mail saying the AECC class is going to be held on this date, on that date, and you are requested to join. Right? And you are expected to respond to this, right? It elicits a response from the receiver or the person with the most reliable information, right? So transactional, it is a give and take, right? So you are expected to respond to this. Very often, Degbe, in your wedding cards, they say RSVP, please respond, right? So these are transactional communications. Very often there are instructional communications. Say, for example, you have you bought a new mobile phone and you have actually a user manual. A user manual tells you what to do when your phone has conked off. That's an instructional manual. Or I tell you what to do once you have received your question paper 1, 2, 3, 4. So instructions instructs the receiver in specific tasks. The instructional mode should be detailed and easily comprehensible. So I will use simple language and I will give you the details. Very often, you see, on the website, Vishwabharati website, they tell you how to register, right? For the exam portal, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So detailed and simple. And format is very important, step by step, bulleted with phrases and diagrams. Very often, diagrams are given, right? Now, you can see this in visual communication also, YouTube videos, how to make this, how to correct this or whatever. And then there is informational written communication, right? So delivering information, right? Say you want to know a research paper or statistics will give us information about what or how many things have been bought, how many things have been sold. There might informational things do not generally require response, and the receiver may or may not revert with clarifications, right? So now these three forms might be interactive also. So instructional and informational might overlap, but these are the three broad modes of written communication in business. So your email to the headmaster informing him that you cannot attend the class due to an illness is informational. Your teacher's email to you telling you how to answer and how to send the online script is instructional, right? And very often a meeting request, quick clarification is transactional, right? Say, for example, Topu just told me, please, could you increase the font? I said, no, I cannot. That is a transactional, communication. If it was in written form, we would have said it was written transactional communication in business. Now let me come to my last slide, really. And this will talk about written communication skills. What are the skills of good written communication? But before that, what are the skills of good oral communication? That is something which we should also very briefly discuss. First and foremost is that, you make sure that the person whom you are talking to can hear you properly and he can understand your language, right? So very often I ask somebody, do you know Bengali? Do you know Hindi? If I take a class and use Bengali words suddenly, and some of you do not know Bengali, then that is wrong communication. That is incomplete communication. So make sure the other person knows your language, right? Secondly, in oral communication or verbal communication, be slow, clear, and precise, right? If you talk very quickly or very softly, then somebody will not understand. If you talk very loudly, somebody may not want to listen to you. So be clear, be slow, and be precise. Don't talk too much. You remember the film Sholay? And you have Basanti. You have Basanti continuously, over expressing herself. And Viru asks, Jai asks him, Tumhara naam kya hai, Basanti? Reminding her that she talks too much. You remember that dialogue where it said, kitni pyari baatein karti hai. And there's the response, pyari nahi, kitni pyari nahi, bahut sari baatein karti hai. So, just as under communication, you have to give proper communication. So enough communication is important. More than enough communication is also a little problematic, right? So give proper, concise, precise information, right? Do not over communicate. Do not use too many bodily gestures. You know, if you are speaking to somebody, right? If you are speaking to somebody, try and be still. You see, my problem in communicating to you often in class is that I move around a lot. So it can be distracting. You stay still, you communicate, and you make eye contact. This is very important. The person to whom you are communicating, look at him. If you do not look at him, then your communication will fail. You will not understand. Also, when you are speaking, understand the bodily or non-verbal feedback. What do I mean by this? That you are speaking in a class, you are speaking in a lecture. Everybody is talking amongst themselves. I am speaking in a class, people are working on their mobile phones. What does that tell me? It tells me that my class is not well received. So not only do I have to make contact with your eyes, which I cannot do at this moment. I do not know whether you are working on your mobile phones. Many of you are. I also have to make eye contact with you, and I have to seek your feedback, read your body language. And I will have to be clear, precise, and within time. That is why I have prepared this slide, so that you can read and you can immediately understand what I am saying. Otherwise, after a certain point of time, remember, our maximum attention span is 20 minutes, right? So when I take a class, what do? I suddenly talk about Basanti and divert your mind for a moment. And then I come back to the point, right? I crack a joke, you laugh. The chain of communication is broken. Your attention now once again needs to come back. So this is very important to understand. If you go on and on and on, you will not be a good communicator. You have to understand also the pulse of the audience, right? Say, I realize that most of you do not want to attend the class today. So what will I do? I will say, those of you who do not want to, please log out. Those of you who want to, please attend the class. You have to understand the pulse of the audience. Only then will you be a good communicator. If you not only speak, but you take a look at the audience, what they are doing, and you listen to them. Please remember that listening to feedback is an equally important part of communication. Say, let me give you an example. Say a washing machine salesman has come to my house and he's going on telling me about how good his washing machine is, and he's asking me to buy his brand, why other brands are, not really workable, and so on and so forth. I try to tell him something, and he does not listen to me. After all, 20 minutes, I tell him, but young man, I have 2 washing machines in my house. So why are you wasting your time? Right? So you have to have feedback also, very importantly, right? So this is and you need to know the culture in which you make a statement. Say, for example, if you go to your elder and say, "Arey yaar, come on," what will he do? He will not communicate with you. You can do that with your friend. You go abroad, you go to another place, and you are not sensitive to their requirements, right? Then you will not make good communication, oral communication. Okay, now let me come to the proper communication skills in writing, right? So first and foremost, you must know your audience. Once again, you need to know what kind of language they will be comfortable with. Say, if many of you do not know English and I start writing very, very difficult English, we will not have good communication. We have to plan and prepare, right? We need to know what message to send. So when I'm starting to prepare a slide, I must know what the content will be, who my students are, what is the syllabus, what do I need to teach them, right? So plan and prepare. Similarly, when you are writing an answer, you have to plan and prepare. You have to gather your material. You have to know your quotations. You have to know your references, right? Then choose words effectively. You have to know which words to choose. Say you are writing to your teacher. You will have to say, respected sir. You'll have to say, please kindly do this. But say when you are writing to a colleague and you are instructing him, you will say, immediately respond to this. But you cannot say this to your teacher. You cannot say, immediately respond to this, right? Then you have to format the write-up. Say, when I teach my students how to write an answer in an examination, as many of my students who are sitting here will be remembering, I tell them, write a clear introduction where you state the problem of the question. Say the question has asked, how is the Panchatantra a political text? And you begin by saying, though it is known as children's literature, the Panchatantra is about Rajniti and it needs to be looked at through a political lens. So you are stating the problem, the thesis. And then you have different paragraphs where you put every point one by one. Divide your letter, divide your email, divide your answer, divide your report into distinct paragraphs. Every new point should have a new paragraph, right? So format the write-up for easy comprehension, and then you give a fitting conclusion, right? So thesis, expansion in paragraphs, formatting it into paragraphs, and finally a logical conclusion. Then, so simple words and phrases. Don't use complex words, complex phrases. They do not make good communication. Use short sentences, right? Many of you very frequently write long sentences in English and therefore make grammatical errors. Plus, they're very tedious to read. So short sentences, sequential and logical flow of thoughts and processes. So one thought should be followed by another logical thought, and judicious use of paragraphs, right? Then you need to edit your writing. Very often what happens is you've written an answer, but you do not revise. Revision is very important in good communication. You will find errors of spelling, errors of language, syntax, and so on and so forth. So you have to have editing done. Say in the computer, when you write on the computer, you will find typos. You need to edit those typos so that people know that not only are you a good communicator, you are also a careful communicator. You see, when you write your job application for the first time, if there are 3 errors in the sentence, then I'll say, this is a careless man. I'll just chuck him or her out and say, I don't need to interview him or her. So your first written application is the first communication which reaches your employer or your teacher. So that needs to be edited properly. Be concise. You know, you say, dear sir, I'm writing to you for this. Kindly do this. Thank you and warm regards. That is it. Don't write anything extra. Unfortunately, what has happened is, in our exams, very often we are asked to write an letter to an editor of a newspaper. Now, how many of you have actually written to an editor of a newspaper any time in your life? I haven't, right? Neither have you. So we do not actually have real-time communication practiced. That is why when we practice emails, we will practice how to write actual emails, the emails or the written communication that you will actually be writing. A written note to your head of the department, a written note to your employer applying for a particular post, a written note to your vice chancellor stating a problem. These are actual writings you write. So You have to be concise. You cannot write more than what is necessary. And you can start and end this is for a proper report or an answer with the key points. For example, I do not know if there are students from social work here, but they very often write field reports. So at the initial part of the field report, they will have to state the problem. The field report was at the village of X, and our intention was to do this. After they have written the report, they say that the findings are that the villages of X do not have good sanitation, and therefore we need to improve the sanitary things, have regular cleaning of the drains, etc., etc. So clear introduction and clear conclusion, right? So those are some of the strategies of good communication skills. Please remember that henceforth, these classes you can take non-seriously as well, because these do not really impact your final marks that much. But please remember that henceforth, all of you will be sitting for examinations, writing out answers, applying for jobs, writing out a CV, and communicating, may it be with your parents, with your friends, girlfriends and boyfriends, with your peers, within your offices later on. All of us are in this complex web of communication all the time. And it is important that we have proper modes of communication, right? We need to be alert not only to verbal communication, but also to non-verbal gestures that will complete the communication. Very often you will supplement your verbal communication with non-verbal modes. So it is important to understand, read somebody else's mind through his non-verbal gestures. A good communicator is one who can use both written, verbal, and non-verbal together. And a genius is one, if there are people in Shangit Bhavan and Kala Bhavan who can communicate through music and through the language of sculpture and painting, because that is a different semiotics, that is a different craft, either of making something very real or communicating the agony or the ecstasy through abstraction, right? That is a different order of communication altogether, right? So in our course, we have taken a look. Let me once again go through what we have taken a look at. We talked about what communication is, the process of sending, the kinds of communication, the models of communication with sender, receiver, the message, context. We talked about feedback, which is important in communicating. We talked about verbal communication and different kinds of verbal communication, non-verbal communication and different constituent elements of non-verbal communication. We talked about the roles played by non-verbal communication. We talked about written communication in business, and we talked about the ways and strategies of effective oral and written communication skills. It is with this, therefore, that I am bringing this discussion to an end. I will, as I point out immediately after the class is over, I will share this entire thing for your benefit on the YouTube page, which your friends can also take a look at. Please inform your friends that the entire lecture will be up on YouTube shortly. Okay, now since a lot of questions are generated at times. If you have any questions, please, we can answer them if you put them forward. You can ask questions now. Are there any questions? I'll stop the recording now then.